Welcome to the 8th webinar in the COVID-19 Ask the Experts webinar series. This webinar will address a specific process for behavioral threat assessment in the virtual environment. I'm Stacey Kalamaris-Skalski, and I'm NASP Director of Professional Policy and Practice, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. The Ask the Experts webinar series is a collection of recorded webinars that are posted on the NASP website. These are designed to support school psychologists in all roles as they navigate the delivery of school telehealth services during the pandemic. Each webinar is free and open to the public and will be followed by a discussion thread that is only open to NASP members. Each webinar will address critical questions emerging as a result of the need to provide virtual telehealth school psych services. They'll offer different kinds of advice and guidance from experts, and also give you some strategies and resources for addressing the different types of professional practice issues that you are encountering. Today, we are going to hear from two experts on behavior and threat assessment in schools. First, Dr. Christina Connolly. Christina is the Director for Psychological Services with the Montgomery County Public Schools. She is responsible for school psychologists and the bilingual team in the Division of Psychological Services. In this role, she oversees Signs of Suicide Prevention Program, Trauma-Informed Schools, and the Behavioral Threat Assessment Initiative. She is the former Director for Crisis Intervention and Safety for the Waukegan, Illinois Public Schools, where she was responsible for managing the 5 missions of emergency management and safety and security. She is the chairperson of NASP School Safety and Crisis Response Committee, and she's the co-author of the Prepare Workshop 1, Crisis Prevention and Preparedness. She's also the co-author of School Crisis Prevention and Intervention, the Prepare Model from 2016. Welcome to Christina. Our second presenter will be Dr. Melissa Reed. And Melissa is an Associate Professor of School Psychology at Winthrop University in South Carolina and a Senior Consultant with Stigma Threat Management and Associates. She is a past president of NASP and a former chair of the NASP National School Safety and Crisis Response Committee. She is a nationally certified school psychologist, a licensed special ed teacher, a licensed professional counselor, and a former district coordinator of social, emotional, and behavioral services. Melissa is the co-author of the NASP Prepare School Crisis Prevention and Intervention curriculum, and she travels both nationally and internationally, training professionals in crisis prevention and intervention, threat and suicide assessment, trauma and PTSD, and cognitive behavioral intervention. She's the co-author of multiple books and publications and has won numerous professional recognition awards. Welcome, Melissa. We also want to give a special shout out today to Dr. Scott Wodaszkowski. He is the professor and director of school psychology program at the University of Wisconsin in River Falls. He contributed to the creation of this webinar also. So thanks, Dr. Scott W. So ladies, if you can, we'd like you to tell us what you think is important for school psychologists to know and be able to do if they're worried about one of their students making threats towards themselves or others. And I think, Christina, I think you're going to start.
Yes. All right. So our anticipated outcomes for this webinar are to understand the similarities and differences in conducting a behavior threat assessment during extended school closures, and then to also to understand the process for managing behavior threat assessment cases in the virtual environment. And so next, we want to go into and show our NASP key resources. And with this, we want people to understand that the information that we are sharing today in regards to the behavior threat assessment and management, or the BTAM, in the virtual environment, this assumes that our leader has at least a basic knowledge of the threat assessment process, threat assessment teams, and the process that has already been established in many of your schools. But we understand that if you are new to behavior threat assessment, after this webinar, please read the more in-depth document titled Behavior Threat Assessment and Management Best Practice Considerations for K-12 Schools. And This handout, in terms of title, Behavior Threat Assessment and Management in the Virtual Environment, also provides additional information that we're going to be covering a lot of in this webinar. So when we are establishing the behavior threat assessment capabilities, one of the big things that we come across when we're training folks around the country is that we have to keep people in mind that the key philosophy is that there is no profile of a student attacker. There are a lot of rumors, there's a lot of innuendos, you'll see things online, so forth. Parents will come to you, they kind of have this mindset of who a student attacker may look like. And many times, who is it? When you think of some of the high-profile cases between, let's go ahead, the Columbine, Virginia Tech, or Sandy Hook, Parkland, and so forth. A lot of times you have in mind who this person is, and that's who people kind of believe are those who are threatening others. We want you to get that kind of bias out of your mind, because when we look at the research behind this, there is no profile of a student attacker. There are male and female attackers, high achieving students with good grades, all the ones with poor performers, and that these acts of violence, again, talking about they're committed by students who are loners, socially isolated, and then also those who are well-liked and popular. So don't focus on these personality traits or whether they do well at school or things like that. And so we have to look at the information, the behaviors of those, and work through the behavior threat assessment process. Again, this is designed to gather the most relevant information about the students' communications and their behavior, looking at negative and stressful events that students have experienced, and also looking at the resources that the students possess in order to overcome these setbacks and challenges. What are the interventions and supports that we can provide for these students? So next we have to look at what types of issues impact student safety. And there are a lot of issues that are there. And on this slide, you see kind of three big ones. And so within my work in Montgomery County, these are some of the biggest things in looking at the cases that we have coming forth for behavior threat assessment. These are three big issues that come to light a lot. And when we get later and talk about step 7 in terms of the looking at the state environment of the schools, what are we doing around sexual harassment? I mean, there are so many cases when we're looking at individuals who are, maybe they like somebody and then that person doesn't like them back, and all of a sudden there's fascination, and then it turns into something ugly. And so what are we doing to teach kids starting at a young age? And again, I'm not talking about teaching kindergartners about dating, but what are we doing to teach kids how to get along with each other and how to deal with rejection, right? And so, let's say somebody doesn't like you, what are you doing to teach them there are other fish in the sea? And so what can we do to teach people, like if somebody doesn't like you, move forward or find somebody else or whatever, and how to deal with these emotions when they come about. And a lot of times you'll see sexual harassment curriculum starting in around middle school. And so what can we do to make sure that all schools have these things in place? Because we find a lot of individuals who want to harm others, sometimes it's due to this issue around dating and feelings around somebody else. Bullying. This is one of the top behaviors that we look at, and these perceptions around people believe that they were bullied and then they want to go and seek revenge. And so when we look at all the data in terms of cases of behavior threat assessment, I mean, it is around between the most recent study that came out in 2018 and the study that came out in 2002, over 70–80% of those attackers believe that they were bullied. And so what are we doing around bullying prevention in our schools? Is a big thing. And then also next, in talking about suicide. What are you doing around suicide prevention? Because many of these individuals may or may not have mental health issues. They may have suicidal ideation, and they may want to go harm others with the intention of killing themselves. And so suicide prevention, again, is another way of looking at safe environment in our schools. And that we, in the DTAM process, have to look at how are we mitigating these stressors and in order to help put people on a more positive pathway in the end, because as you'll keep hearing, it's about the interventions and supports that we provide for individuals, and having these types of preventative activities and creating safe environments can help to provide individuals with the intervention support that they need. All right, so next, we also want to make sure folks have an understanding that, and this is from research done by Dr. Joy Turnell, and that while any student can make a threat, relatively few will engage in the planning and preparation necessary to carry this out. And this is especially true, and we have in place in our schools the intervention support to help these individuals, because I tell folks, like, look, I live in DC, and there is this highway called 270, right? And it is back-to-back traffic all day long, and everybody there has like road rage. And you're driving down, and people are cutting you off and doing all these horrible things, and you're sitting there like, you're mad, right? But wow, you're driving, and this experience yourself, just because somebody's done something that made you really, really mad, right? And you may think, like, I can hit that person, but just because you said that you're making a threat doesn't mean that you're actually going to go for it and put forth the planning activities and preparations to actually go for it to do harm. You had an idea in your head. And so when we think about kids in your classroom, they may say something, like, I hate you, I hate that teacher, blah, blah, blah. But are they actually going to go for it and do it? And so there's a difference between somebody making a threat and posing a threat. Someone who's actually going to go forth, put forth the activities and so forth to do it. But a lot of times in schools, we have to deal with fear, and that bias kicks in. And then because of that fear, it triggers us to have these feelings, oh my God, like because this kid said this, that means they're actually going to do it, and it doesn't. The threat assessment process is here to help so that as we move forward, having a better understanding of someone who may make a threat and says this thing, but actually are they truly going forth with the planning, preparation, acquisition in order to carry out their threat. And so we're going to transition next to our lovely Dr. Reeves, who's going to get into how to establish these teams to help you through this process.
Hello there. So what we're going to be covering is actually 8 steps in regards to what needs to be in place in order to have a really good BTM process. Now, again, we are really focusing on how this plays out in the virtual environment. And where these 8 steps come from is the National Threat Assessment Center published a document in 2018 titled Enhancing School Safety Using a Threat Assessment Model. So if you are not familiar with that document or these 8 steps, you can find additional information in that resource, because we're going to be highlighting these 8 steps and then really focusing on how this plays out in the virtual environment. So the first thing is, even in the virtual environment, you are still going to be utilizing the multidisciplinary team that you should already have in place. Those core team members should include someone from administration, at least one, but preferably more than one school mental health professional, such as a school psychologist, a school counselor, a school social worker. You want to make sure that you have your school resource officer or law enforcement as part of this core team. And then also, if you also have school security, if the student of concern being brought forward is involved in special education, you definitely want to make sure that you have someone from their special ed team to make sure that we are also following all of the protocols and regulations around special education. Then other team members that are obviously added in are going to be those that have the best knowledge of the particular student of concern or the situation of concern that is being brought forward. So in regards to, how this works in the virtual environment, the bottom line is the multidisciplinary team still needs to be intact and still needs to be in place. And we will still be utilizing that multidisciplinary team that schools have, okay? So what this means is that obviously, since we're not within the confines of a school building, these teams are going to need to meet virtually. So if a concern is brought forward, and we'll talk more about that later on, you need to have a secure platform for which you can follow your BTM process and have confidential conversations. So you want to make sure that whatever cloud-based platform that is being used is secure. You also still want to make sure that you are clearly assigning the individual responsibilities for all of your team members to make sure that all components of the BTM process get carried out. You may also want to consider utilizing a spreadsheet or a project management platform to keep track of those assignments, the deadlines for which those assignments need to be met, and then being able to document when those assignments are completed. Also, expect interruptions. I mean, we're all working from home these days. Many of our educators are also juggling family responsibilities. So you want to make sure too that you have those team meetings that are flexible, planning for some of those interruptions, but also really making sure that we adopt that care for the caregiver attitude and culture, because doing the BTM process and having to conduct a threat assessment virtually while also juggling all of the other responsibilities that many of us have, it's definitely a lot. So we definitely want to make sure that we are supporting our team members within this process. The other important piece is that, is team composition different in the virtual environment? No. So your team should still remain the same, but if you do have a team member that is not able to engage in a threat assessment that needs to be done, rather expediently, then you want to make sure that you have those backup folks identified, just as you have done prior within your process. Where it does change a little bit, though, is in the fact that our community providers may be more critical earlier on in this process. So since we do not have access to students, previously we could pull them from the class environment, we could have conversations with them, we could assess for both physical and psychological safety. We don't necessarily have the ability to do that right now, or at least not as easy as before. So we want to make sure that we have good partnerships with our local law enforcement, our community mental health providers, other community supports that might be engaged with a particular individual, because we may have to engage them earlier on in the process in order to do some of those safety checks if we are unable to get a hold of a student or get a hold of a student's parents. Which also then means we may need to revise the memorandums of understanding that some of our teams have developed with community resources and update those MOUs to accommodate the virtual environment. But also, what is still most critically important is to make sure that we have identified a trusted adult for that person of concern. Because just as was the case when schools were in session, we do know that students and others are going to open up and share more information if they trust the individual that they're talking with. So just as you have previously done within your BTM process, depending on the individual of concern being brought forward or those individuals that we need to gather the information from, who is that person on your BTM team or in the community that they are going to be the most trusting of, that they're going to be willing to share that information with. Okay. Then moving on to step 2 is that we do need to define prohibited and concerning behaviors. So just as we've done in the past, you still want to make sure it's very clear to all of your teachers, your support staff, and your students, even in the virtual environment, that what are those behaviors that they need to bring forward to the threat assessment team. And again, as Christina mentioned before, we're going to be using this process to really help make that distinction between making a threat and posing a threat. So obviously, if anyone is making a statement of, I want to kill you or harm somebody else, or there's any mention of a weapon, we do need to engage the BTM process to further assess to see, is there some legitimacy? Do they actually pose a threat versus just making a threat? The other piece that is part of this is that, what we can expect and what we have actually seen in some of the cases that we're currently working is that we're seeing an increase of some of these threats being made on social media now that the students are not having direct contact with each other. We also have to assess for a potential increase in engagement in the virtual communities that are encouraging violence, because students now have more time at home. Many of them may not have a lot of supervision into their online activities, so they actually can have more time now to engage with some of those virtual communities that encourage violence. We may also see threats made during video conferencing classroom sessions, and we'll talk more about how do we, work with our teachers on what do they do if they see that kind of behavior. We potentially can see an increase in cyberbullying, increased resentment due to societal and educational inequities. For those that may start to actually develop some mental health concerns because of the social isolation that they are currently experiencing, or those individuals that previously had mental health concerns, we may see an increase in symptomatology just because of the stressors of not being around a lot of their primary support systems. So we want to be looking for, are we seeing a potential increase in anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, substance abuse as ways to cope with some of the stressors they're going through, because all of those can contribute to escalating risk. What we have definitely been seeing is an increase in reports of domestic violence. So for some of our students that are in homes where there may be an increase in domestic violence activity, we definitely want to make sure that we are assessing for that and putting the right resources in place. And then also just looking at what are some of those other stressors that the student, the family may be under. Because when we get to the management piece, that's going to be real important to mitigate risk, is that we get some interventions in place where we can help address some of these concerning behaviors that may be coming forward. So some other contributing factors that can also increase risk during physical distancing is a decrease in the adult supervision. So as mentioned before, for example, they just have more time to get on some of those, what I refer to as negative internet activity sites, and decrease access to some of the protective factors that we know that mitigate risk. So just as has been done previously, your BTM teams, in addition to collecting a lot of really good data that we're going to talk more in depth about in subsequent slides, part of that difference between making a threat and posing a threat is we also need to assess for factors according to what we refer to as the TOADS acronym. Do they have the time to plan, carrying out an act of violence? Do they have an increase in opportunities to be able to do so? Do they have the ability and the desire to actually carry it out? And then the stimuli are those stressors. What are those things that are actually negatively impacting their life right now that are contributing to their desire to want to harm others as a way to manage some of those stressors? This then leads us into a really critically important step, which is step 3. We still need to have a centralized reporting mechanisms available to our students, staff, parents, and our community in general. So take a look at what did you have in place previously for students and staff and family and community members to report. Was there an online form? Was there a dedicated email address or phone number? Did they report concerns through a phone app? Was there an anonymous reporting procedure? There's always 911. One of the most effective ways is definitely that they could go to a trusted adult. But in the virtual environment that we're in right now, some of these, previously available methods of reporting may not be as easily accessible. For an example, tell an adult. Because they can't just walk through the hallway, find someone that they trust and say, hey, can I share this with you? I'm a little concerned. So what we need to make sure that we're currently doing is continuing to train and bring awareness to, even in this virtual environment, if there are concerning behaviors that are seen or statements that are made or social media posts that are recognized, how do they, in this current environment, how do they bring this forward? Where do they go? And what is that reporting mechanism that your school and your school district has in place? The other thing that we need to be aware of is some of those cultural considerations is that past traumas or just community dynamics may impact how comfortable they are reporting. So for example, there have been students that have made comments like snitches, get stitches. So we need to really explain the harm can be done when people don't report. So we need to address that bystander effect and really emphasize that school safety is still critically important even in this virtual environment. Okay. Then this leads us to step 4, is at what point do we engage law enforcement? Okay. Now we know if there are reports of weapons, threats of violence, physical violence, or any serious additional concerns, we need to engage our law enforcement partners. Now, prior to COVID-19, many schools had school resource officers on campus, or at least had a direct line to access a law enforcement officer. Nowadays, what we're seeing happen with the COVID-19 is that our law enforcement or our school resource officers have actually been reassigned to other duties. So what we need to figure out in this current environment is if you do have a concern where you need to engage law enforcement, or say there's also some suicidal ideations going on where we need to engage mental health intervention, what is that current process? Who do we contact? What does that look like? And have you collaborated with those individuals and they're comfortable engaging with the school team to assess for risk and then taking appropriate actions? But what's really important is that even if we engage some of our other partners, if they determine that that person of concern is not an imminent threat, it doesn't absolve the school team from completing the BTAM process. The school team still needs to follow through with their behavioral threat assessment and management process and protocols, because we are still responsible as schools for putting the appropriate interventions in place to help mitigate risk. And then I'm going to turn this over for step 5, back to Christina.
Okay, thank you. And as we think about our next steps in terms of the establishment of our assessment procedures, and that one of the biggest things, and I've had some folks email me during this process while schools are closed to say, well, are we still responsible for conducting these threat assessment cases? And it's like, yes, absolutely. We are, your teams in your buildings are still responsible for gathering data and going through the behavior threat assessment process while schools are closed. And it's kind of like, because unfortunately, many times there's this mindset around, well, it's out of sight, out of mind. It's kind of like, oh, well, they go to another school, it isn't a problem anymore. If they graduate, it isn't a problem anymore. No. And so the same thing while schools are closed now, we are still responsible for this process. And so with this, so we have to use a multi-method, multi-source approach in order to gather information as we're going through and conducting this process. And keeping in mind that we can still look at online sources, looking at what are they doing on social media, are they making TikTok videos, are they putting things on Snapchat or Instagram, and looking for those things in terms of what they're doing online. What are they saying on the virtual platforms? Like, let's say if they're having a virtual class, and what are they saying in the chat boxes? Are they saying things, making threats, so forth? We had 2 students that were making threats against a teacher, and they were using the chat in order to go back and forth with each other, and the teacher didn't see. So we have to look at maybe different methods than what we used previously in order to gather this information. You can still conduct interviews with the person of concern and others who may have information. So you can use your virtual platforms that you're using, like Zoom, Google Meet, WebEx, so forth. Are you using a different phone number like Google Voice in order to make phone calls to individuals? And then also looking at your your records review, working with law enforcement, do they have any type of discipline issues, the class assignments that they may have. So as we're going through this, we still have to remember that it is important to build rapport with others that you're gathering information from, whether it's the person of the concern, whether it's any target, whether it's any witnesses who may have information, the parents of both the targets and the person of concern, and gathering that rapport in terms of being able to help you to gather this information. And the biggest things is that, and I know sometimes it's hard because people can kind of see it as like, well, wait, you're trying to blame my kid. No, the goal of this, and parents and students also need to see this as this process is an intervention. This is not a disciplinary process. This is a process where we are providing interventions and supports for those who may be in trouble, who may need these supports in place. And that because this isn't supposed to be punitive. And so we want to make sure that the teams are evaluating the students' concerns based upon their age, their socio-emotional and developmental levels, and also looking at the context of the threat, like what happened, what was going on. And so, because initially it can look like it was a threat on the surface, right? And then after utilizing, going through the BTAM process and realizing, like, wait a minute, like this wasn't really a threat. And that maybe the words were taken out of context, or maybe it's just like they said something in the heat of the moment. Like I tell my teams, look at what the kid said and tell me, if 3 hours later they don't mean it anymore, then typically it was just something that was said in the heat of the moment. It might have made everyone really scared. But those who actually pose a threat, it does take, like they take time and plan out and gather materials and so forth. It is not something like, an hour later they're remorseful, they're sorry, they're crying, they didn't mean it, and so forth. And so we really have to, it's important to go through this process. All right, so then as we keep going through step 5, that we have to look at these investigative themes in terms of their motives, looking at the concerning, unusual, threatening communications. Do they have access to weapons, right? That should be one of the first questions we go forward and try to ask. And the police may help as well, because in our community, they can go to the home and do a check to see if they have access to weapons at a home. And even if our police officers, they went to the home, they found the child's journal where she had a hit list of many kids that she was going out trying to develop a plan of how she was going to kill. And then we're looking at the stressful event, the capacity to carry out the event, these pathway behaviors in terms of the ideation, the planning, preparation, acquisition. When are they going to actually go out and implement this? But also important piece is looking at the protective factors. What's there to help this child? Are there parents that are supportive, friends, community networks, so forth, that can help them through this process? And then, so one of the things we've had to experience during the virtual environment is what happens when you have parents who are refusing to cooperate during this. And that we have to make sure that we're emphasizing the collaborative process, that it is a team, we're all working together. This isn't a punitive action. What we are doing is to try to help their child in terms of providing interventions and supports for them. But we also want to make sure that we are validating their current stressors. Like, there's a lot of things going on in the community right now, and maybe they're being uncooperative just due to the stress of the pandemic. What other things can we do to provide supports for them? Are there food insecurity, shelter insecurity, job insecurity, so forth, that may be like why they're being resistant? So look at some of looking at the precipitating factors that are involved with this. And that, how are we going to document the actions that you're taking, trying to secure permission in terms of working with the students of concern, any targets, but then also if the families are still uncooperative, and as appropriate, we may have to refer these cases to appropriate authorities in our communities, and that could be law enforcement, community mental health, and it could mean Child Protective Services if they're completely no, and this child truly is a threat to others. You may need to call Child Protective Services to help with this. But you must document all attempts that you have tried and all referrals that are made to show that you have tried to do their due diligence during this process. And as an administrator, I cannot stress enough the importance of documentation. And so, also, as you're establishing your procedures, you got to look at any additional considerations in terms of being within the virtual environment. And that could be looking at the types of video conferencing platforms that you're using, and that it must be in a secured environment. And so for us in schools, we made a decision that we aren't going to allow staff to use, let's say, for instance, the free Zoom platform, because we saw the FBI's warnings, all these things going on. So the school district purchased a Zoom platform that is secure. And so that way, information can be shared via this secure platform. And that using this may be preferred over doing, let's say, phone interviews, because you can see the individual and see what they're saying, how they're saying it, and looking for those visual cues that you just can't get when you're over the phone. Now, you might not, have that as an option in some places, but if that's possible, if you can use a video conferencing platform so that you can watch the individual, just like you're at school, you can watch and see what they're saying, that is best. And then also, you may want to ask who is present in the room with them. And so, because you want to make sure this is a confidential conversation. Are there siblings, other family members, other folks who are there watching this? And then also looking at other issues around privacy, confidentiality, and having conversations around the confidentiality of the process, and the limitations of confidentiality in case something comes up where somebody's threatening someone or someone to harm themselves. And that also looking at the virtual retrieval of student and staff member records. And that how can you pull this information? You're not in the school, so you just can't go down the hall, go to the office and check the student records. How much information is online so that you can go and gather this information? Some school districts have a lot of things online, and others it's paper pencil. So, and looking at how you're going to gain access to these things. All right. And step 6, developing your risk management options. And so, one of the critical steps in looking at this is, and a lot of people, they focus on the assessment, but what are we going to do to help to manage this? What are the interventions and supports? I have a lot of schools that are like, oh, and they go through the assessment piece and they determine the threat level, and then it's like, they think it's over, and I'm like, no, you just began. That's at the very beginning. The long part is the management process that we have to follow. And so we have to develop risk management options to intervene and de-escalate the stressors that are impacting why this person wants to do harm to others. And so although school teams don't have direct access to students, they can still progress monitor them and do virtual check-ins with students or provide virtual counseling or other mental health supports with them. You can also make referrals to community or other virtual supports to the students and to their families, and that, because we know that the systems may be overtaxed right now in your communities. There's a lot of things going on during the COVID-19, but it is critical that teams have to know what resources are available, what's still open, what's considered essential in your communities. And that also still remembering that consequences alone don't change behavior. So just because you go and you suspend a kid doesn't mean all of them are going to change. I mean, how many kids do you sit forth and suspend like 2, 3, 4 times, and teachers are like, you know, it's like a holiday for them. The kid comes back, they're still doing the same thing. Has it changed their behavior? No, it hasn't. So what are the interventions that we're going to provide? I know I'm speaking to the choir, but what are the interventions supports we're going to provide for these individuals? Because typically, behavior threat assessment teams are not deemed to be disciplinary. We are to provide intervention support. And sometimes I have someone who's like, if they're misbehaving in school, we're going to suspend them. I'm like, what, suspend them to their room? They're still like, they're home. Like, what type of suspension is that going to look like? So we really have to be creative in thinking about what are the supports that we're going to provide for them, because this pure discipline is not going to be enough right now. Okay. So, and then as we are looking at some other things, so managing victim fear when schools are closed. So one of the big things is if you have somebody who's making a threat against someone, what are we doing for the target? What are we doing for those who have been victimized by this process? And that we have to make sure that we're helping the target to potentially limit their social media presence, right? So that it makes the person less likely for the person who's threatening them to interact with them. Maybe it's a list of privacy settings, turn off location trackers on their phone or on any type of post that they're making sure that their friends aren't tagging them to post online. And that what are we doing to assist teachers in monitoring chats and in the virtual classrooms, as I said before. And so also, when we're managing the person of concern, we have to ask families to block access to weapons, increase their monitoring of what the individual is doing. And then also, what else are we doing to reduce the stressors by assisting the families with their basic needs, their social support, safety measures, and then also, are we going to work with law enforcement if we think that the student is thinking planning violence? Because they may have to go and check in with the families as well. All right, so then step 7, in terms of the development of the creation of these safe school climates. So as I talked about earlier, we want to make sure that we're reinforcing a safe school and home environment while we're providing the virtual education. And so we're looking at this with both our students and our staff, and that we want to make sure all staff are encouraged to continue to build those positive, trusting relationships with their students. If you're seeing issues around cyberbullying that's happening, and again, you're going to have to look at the chats, you're going to have to look at your homework assignments, things that are coming in, and that how else are we providing support to our staff as well, and looking at that care for the caregiver support? Do you have EAP? Do you have, with the Employee Assistance Program, do you have other resources that are available for them? And last step, step 8, training for all. We have to make sure that school safety is everyone's responsibility. It's not just the principal, it's just not just the security staff, so forth, everyone's responsibility. So we have to make sure that we're providing training on how to report in the virtual environment, making sure all school staff receive training and not just during a staff meeting, because as we know, a lot of times our certified staff are only want to attend those. So how are we getting to all staff members? How are we working with our students, parents, law enforcement? And let's say because of your virtual environment, you have new BTAM members to the team. You need to train them as well.
Okay, wow, that was a wealth of information. And I do want to have just a little bit of a discussion about some of the things that you all are talking about. First of all, I was wondering, Melissa, if you could just talk a little bit about some of the documentation that might be needed for virtual threat assessments and just where it should be kept. People aren't in their normal offices, and you know, the question is, you know, are these educational records? Are they not? And so, can you talk just a little bit about the documentation in virtual threat assessments?
Yeah, the bottom line is whatever documentation you were using previously, you should still be utilizing that same type of documentation. Now, if you only had your BTM protocol in paper pencil format, then what you're going to need to make sure is that someone has access to the file that they can then send to others on the BTM team to make sure that all the right questions and the steps that everyone has taken is being documented appropriately. The storage of those documents is going to be really an internal decision based upon that school team or the district, because a lot of it is going to depend on, you know, if they're storing them electronically, do they have a secure confidential storage platform? Many schools do nowadays. But the bottom line is the documentation piece is still absolutely critical. The protocol you followed before should still be the same protocol that you're following now. The key, though, is that if there's certain types of information that you were unable to get access to, that documentation needs to reflect what did you at least attempt to do in order to get access to that piece of information. And document all the attempts that your team made. And same thing, if you referred out to some community resources or you made a report to some other community agency, document what you did in order to make that report and what response did you get. But the bottom line is the paperwork protocol should still be the same. It's just a matter of, in the virtual environment, you know, you might have to be doing it electronically and ensure that you're, you know, that whatever platform you're using to share that information or that protocol back and forth is secure.
Okay. All right. Another question I was thinking of was just in relation to some of the policies that might exist. And I don't know if whether both of you want to kind of tackle this or if one of you does, but I'm just wondering about threat assessment policies that are actually on the books and how they might need to be modified for this virtual environment, and what process maybe should be pursued for that. You know, is it okay to just do a separate MOU, or do we need to take these differences to our school boards and have them discuss them? Can you just talk a little bit about sort of the policies that are involved in virtual threat assessment versus the established threat assessment policies we already have in districts?
So I know for us in Montgomery County, so we differentiate between a policy and, let's say, like a regulation. The policy is really broad. And so it says that you have to have behavior threat assessment procedures in place in schools. So it doesn't specify like what that looks like. And we have a regulation that goes more into that saying that you must do it. But that's still at a 10,000-foot level. And so you have to be careful in terms of, because you may have like the policy, but do you have other procedures that you may have to change and address and then get approval for it? Because that might be a much shorter process. It took us 6 months to do a policy. Hopefully by 6 months we're back in school. Because in some school districts it takes a long time to go forward with that process. But you have to look at your procedures, look at your team. You may need to go forth to get approval in terms of how you're going to do this in a virtual environment, and does that look different? Or is your policy and procedures broad enough where it allows you to do it either in person or virtually, or doesn't specify it? So, but it is a good question to ask in terms of, because your policies give you the foundation for what you need to do. And so does it give you the foothold in order to be able to transition into this virtual environment? Because if it says, like, for instance, all these things have to be done in person, then you're going to have to go forth and change it. But if it doesn't, it just says go forth and do it, then you may not have to go forth and change it. You're just going to tweak it a bit because you're doing it virtually. It really depends on what is written. So I would suggest that for teams and those, go and look at your policies and see what does it say. If you have a behavior threat assessment policy, what are the specifics that are around that? And if it does need to be changed, then you may have to work with your administrators, your superintendent, school board in order to make those changes. So that would, changing a policy requires a school board meeting. But if it's not in there and it's just like a regulation, or if it's just procedure, then it just may be something that needs to go forward and get approved by senior leadership. So talk with your supervisors, check your policy, read that to see what is the process for that.
Yeah. Essentially, take a look at your procedures now and take it from step one all the way through the end, and what needs to be tweaked for the virtual environment. You know, for example, it starts with reporting a concern coming in. Does those reporting mechanisms need to change because of the virtual environment we're in or not? If they don't need to change because students can, and staff members and parents can still access the reporting mechanisms, we might just need to reinforce it. Previously, it used to be, you know, someone at the school is going to gather the team, you're going to meet in a central location. Well, now you can't physically meet in a central location, so how would the team meeting look like virtually? So essentially, I would recommend just take your procedures from step one all the way through the end, walk through them, and what do we need to tweak because of the virtual environment that we're currently in, and what can remain the same.
Sounds great. Those are excellent tips as we go through this. Before we are getting we're getting very close to the end here, and before we get into some of the resources that NASP has and external resources, I'm wondering if each of you just have one little tidbit. What would you say is your most important advice for people who are engaging in virtual threat assessment at this time? Melissa, why don't you begin?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is really to reinforce to everyone that school safety is still the responsibility of schools, regardless if we're, you know, under brick and mortar schools or in the virtual environment, and to use the process that you already have in place and just tweak it for the virtual environment. You know, if any concerns of safety come forward, we are still responsible for taking action on those concerns. And again, follow the process that's there. And tweak it if needed. But the important piece is we've got to still follow the process and intervene. As Christina said before, it is a problem-solving, collaborative support process. And that's really what this is all about. People are under a lot of stress these days. We can be of help.
Christina, anything to add there?
I would say, so one of the things I've learned doing these in the virtual environment right now is that you have to work with your outside agencies because it's not as easy as just going down the hall and interviewing a kid or going to the home and talking with a family member, in that we have had a lot of reliance on our police, our law enforcement support, outside agencies who are able to work to go to the home to check on kids who are going through this process, and that is key. But it was important that we had those relationships before COVID-19. We got to make sure they continue during the pandemic and after the pandemic, because I am just so grateful for our law enforcement partners right now going through this. We could not manage the cases that we have currently without them. So having those relationships, those MOUs squared up is key because we're all in this together, and we all are going to have to work together in order to make sure that we continue with our process, because our teams are still functioning even though the physical school is closed. Virtual school is still in session. So we all got to work on this together.
Great. As we wrap up today, let me then just direct all of our listeners to our NASP COVID-19 resources. The different documents that Christina and Melissa have talked about today are linked in your PowerPoints. PowerPoints will be posted on the website. You can go into that PowerPoint and click directly on the links and retrieve the documents that they referred to today, both the internal NASP documents related to the COVID-19 threat assessment procedures, as well as the external documents from the Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education. We want to encourage everybody to then leave and this webinar and go to the NASP member exchange and to begin your discussions. These wonderful presenters will periodically chime in there as well as many other experts in the NASP community who have been engaged in virtual threat assessment. We want to thank Melissa and Christina and Scott all for their contributions to this webinar today. We are hopeful that it is informative and helpful to you, and we thank all of you for listening, and we wish you safe and healthy days ahead.